In the spring of 1944, the war was at a crucial tipping point. The Allies were fighting on multiple fronts, and despite the steady push through Italy and the air bombardment campaign over Germany, the fate of Western Europe was still up in the air. The Nazis had dug in deep across France, and every day the invasion was delayed, the greater the risk that the momentum would shift in favor of the Axis powers. The Nazis were entrenched in their stronghold on the Western Front, with a fortified line stretching across France, and only one thing stood between the Allies and the heart of Hitler's empire: the beaches of Normandy. To succeed, a massive invasion would be required, one that could pierce the Atlantic Wall and push through to liberate France and eventually reach Berlin. But the question that haunted every Allied leader was, could they pull it off? In Washington, London, and Moscow, the pressure was building, and it was clear. The Allies needed a victory, and they needed it fast. If the D-Day invasion failed, the Allies would be set back years. The war would continue, and more lives would be lost. The American and British forces had been planning for years, but a success wasn't guaranteed. The invasion would demand an extraordinary combination of military genius, bravery, and coordination. It was at this critical juncture that General Dwight D. Eisenhower, Supreme Commander of the Allied Expeditionary Force, had to make a pivotal decision. He needed a leader to command the forces poised for the invasion. This would be no ordinary task. The pressure was unprecedented, and any wrong move could send the entire operation and the war into chaos. In that tense atmosphere, Eisenhower appointed General Omar Bradley. Bradley wasn't a flamboyant commander, nor a man prone to grandiose speeches or bold promises. He was known for his calm demeanor, his sharp military mind, and his ability to make decisions under extreme pressure. But at this moment, nothing could prepare him for what lay ahead. The world was watching, and history would judge him based on the outcome of that day. But did he truly know what he was walking into? The appointment itself was a moment of significant weight, but it wasn't just about Bradley. It was about the fate of millions of people, both military and civilian. It was about the course of the war. It was about a world desperately searching for a way out of the darkness. As the days ticked down to the invasion, the Allies could only hope that the men leading them could rise to the occasion. For Bradley, this was no longer just about winning a battle. It was about taking on the burden of an entire world's hope. When General Dwight D. Eisenhower made the decision to appoint Omar Bradley as the commander of the 1st U.S. Army for the Normandy invasion, it wasn't made lightly. At a time when the Allies were preparing to launch the most ambitious military operation in modern history, Eisenhower had to carefully select a leader who could bear the weight of responsibility without faltering under the immense pressure. Bradley wasn't a household name before D-Day. He wasn't the flamboyant, charismatic figure like General Patton or the towering public persona of General Montgomery. Instead, Bradley was a man who thrived in the shadows, known for his deep understanding of the military and his ability to build relationships with those under his command. His reputation, though quieter than that of some of his peers, spoke volumes to those who knew him. He was a problem solver, a man who could see the long game in a way few could, and he had a knack for remaining calm and composed under fire. Born into humble beginnings, Bradley was a career soldier who had climbed the ranks steadily, relying not on ambition alone, but on sheer competence. He was respected by his fellow officers not for his flashy speeches, but for his calm demeanor in the face of adversity. He didn't need to be the loudest voice in the room. His leadership was built on quiet determination, practical decision-making, and an ability to understand the soldiers he commanded. Unlike Montgomery, whose ego was often a source of tension with other Allied commanders, or Patton, whose bravado was legendary, Bradley was a leader who made decisions based on what was best for the mission and his men. He understood that the strength of an army lies not just in strategy, but in the morale of its soldiers, and he earned the respect of his troops by showing them that he understood their hardships. He spoke to them as equals, not superiors, and made it clear that the fight was as much for them as it was for the greater cause. When Eisenhower appointed Bradley, it was not just because of his military acumen, it was because he trusted him. Eisenhower had worked with Bradley before, and he knew that Bradley possessed an essential quality that many other leaders lacked: the ability to handle tremendous pressure with grace. Eisenhower had to be sure that the man in charge on D-Day wouldn't be swayed by the chaos of war, and Bradley fit that role perfectly. But there were challenges that Bradley had to face almost immediately. With the magnitude of the operation growing daily, he had to navigate the politics of command. While Eisenhower and Bradley had a close working relationship, the rest of the Allied High Command was filled with tension. Montgomery, in particular, had his own vision of how the invasion should unfold, often clashing with Bradley's more methodical and cautious approach. Where Montgomery was bold and forceful in his strategies, Bradley was more conservative, preferring to move with precision and avoid unnecessary risks. Despite these differences, Bradley's calm, pragmatic approach began to win the respect of those who had initially questioned his leadership. It became clear that Bradley wasn't just a tactician. He was a leader who understood the emotional and psychological toll the war took on those involved. He knew that his men would have to endure horrors they couldn't yet comprehend, and he would need to lead them through that. At the same time, Bradley understood that he was not leading in isolation. The invasion was a joint effort, one that required the cooperation of the American, British, Canadian, and other Allied forces. And in this moment, with the weight of history on his shoulders, Bradley's reputation as a steady, dependable leader would be tested in ways few could imagine. With every day that passed, the pressure mounted. But Bradley, calm, composed, and steadfast, was ready. His leadership would be tested on the beaches of Normandy, but he had already begun to prove to his peers and to himself that he had what it took to lead the Allies through the storm ahead. As the Allies prepared for the monumental task of invading Normandy, one of the most critical dynamics within the High Command was the tension between General Bradley and General Bernard Montgomery. On paper, both men shared the same goal: to liberate France and defeat Nazi Germany. However, in practice, their leadership styles couldn't have been more different, and this contrast created friction that would play out in the months leading up to D-Day. Montgomery, a British officer known for his boldness, had an unshakable confidence in his ability to lead. His aggressive approach to warfare was marked by a desire to control the narrative and a strong belief that decisive, swift action was the key to victory. Montgomery had already built a reputation as a hero in North Africa, where his leadership helped turn the tide in the Battle of El Alamein. His successes made him a natural candidate to take charge of one of the key sectors of the invasion. But while his reputation as a strategist was impressive, his personality and his style of command often rubbed others the wrong way. Bradley, by contrast, was the epitome of a methodical, cautious leader. His approach to warfare was grounded in planning, precision, and an understanding that war was as much about logistics as it was about combat. Where Montgomery thrived in the spotlight, often making bold pronouncements about his success and his plans, Bradley was quiet and reserved, preferring to let his actions speak for themselves. He understood that, for the invasion to succeed, every detail had to be accounted for. There was no room for bravado. But while his approach was grounded in careful strategy, it was also slower and more measured, and that didn't always sit well with Montgomery. The friction between the two men began to surface during the early stages of planning for D-Day. Montgomery, determined to take control of the British forces, was adamant about his own vision of how the invasion should unfold. He pushed for a single, large-scale assault, aimed at quickly breaking through the German defenses. His plan was bold and aggressive, relying on overwhelming force to punch a hole through the enemy lines. Bradley, on the other hand, advocated for a more measured approach. His plan called for a multi-phase landing, with forces landing at multiple beaches to spread out the enemy's defenses and create opportunities for follow-up attacks. He believed that caution and coordination, rather than raw force, would be the key to breaking through the Nazi defenses. The disagreement between the two generals was not just tactical. It was deeply personal. Montgomery had a tendency to take credit for successes and was quick to blame others for failures. His desire to control the narrative sometimes put him at odds with his fellow commanders. In contrast, Bradley was far more collaborative, seeking to work with the team rather than dominate it. He believed that the strength of the Allied effort lay in its unity, and he was not inclined to engage in public displays of ego. The tensions between Montgomery and Bradley were not just a matter of personality. They also had real consequences for the invasion. Montgomery's insistence on pushing his own strategy created delays in the planning process, while Bradley's more cautious approach sometimes led to frustration among the other commanders, who felt that his hesitancy could compromise the effectiveness of the invasion. As the invasion date drew closer, these tensions became harder to ignore. Bradley and Montgomery's differing philosophies were not just a minor issue. They were emblematic of the larger challenge of coordinating a massive international coalition. The Allies, despite their shared objective, were a group of nations with different cultures, military traditions, and leadership styles. Each general, each commander, had to navigate not just the complexities of the battlefield, but also the politics of cooperation. Yet, despite their differences, both men knew that the success of the invasion would depend on their ability to work together. Eisenhower, ever the diplomat, had to carefully manage the relationship between his two generals. He recognized that the stakes were too high for personal rivalry to interfere with the mission. Both Montgomery and Bradley were excellent leaders in their own right, but the key would be finding a way to reconcile their approaches and unite their forces. In the end, it was Bradley's steady leadership and ability to collaborate that ultimately carried the day. Montgomery's boldness and desire for glory were tempered by the reality of war on the ground. Despite their differences, both men would play crucial roles in the invasion. But the story of D-Day wasn't just one of military tactics, it was one of human dynamics, the personal conflicts and cooperation that shaped the course of history. Bradley's success in navigating the internal politics of the invasion proved to be as critical to the mission as his tactical decisions on the ground. While Montgomery's strategy was influential, it was Bradley's steady hand that helped keep the Allied forces together, ensuring that the operation would move forward despite the many obstacles and tensions that stood in the way. The day had arrived. The beach at Normandy on June 6, 1944, was the stage for one of the most daring and perilous military operations in history. For General Bradley, it wasn't just about executing a strategy. It was about ensuring that every soldier under his command could survive the onslaught. The plan was in motion, but as with any large-scale invasion, the reality was far messier than anyone could have predicted. Hours before the first wave of American soldiers stormed Omaha Beach, Bradley stood in his command center, anxiously awaiting news from the front. The weather had delayed the invasion by a day, and the nerves of every officer in the room were fraying. Everything had been meticulously planned, but the unknowns were immense. The element of surprise was key, but even that had its limits. The Germans were expecting an invasion somewhere along the French coast, and the success of the operation hinged on how well the Allies could adapt once the battle began. Bradley's responsibility was massive. He wasn't just leading a division or even a single army. He was overseeing a multinational force that stretched across multiple beaches, each with its own challenges. The sheer scale of the operation was overwhelming. 160,000 soldiers from the United States, the United Kingdom, and Canada were set to land across 5 beaches, with an additional air and naval bombardment supporting the assault. The tides, the terrain, and the unpredictable weather added layers of complexity that no amount of preparation could fully mitigate. As the landing began, Bradley's calm demeanor was tested. The first reports came in quickly. Waves of soldiers were hitting the beaches, but they were met with fierce resistance. The Germans had fortified the coast with obstacles, machine gun positions, and artillery that could cut down any force trying to breach the defenses. Bradley knew that Omaha Beach was the most heavily defended sector, but the sight of so many men lost to enemy fire still struck him deeply. For every soldier who made it ashore, there were more who fell in the surf, unable to make it past the hail of bullets and mortar shells. The weight of responsibility pressed on Bradley's shoulders more than ever. One of the first decisions Bradley faced was whether to reinforce Omaha Beach, which was quickly becoming a bloodbath, or to continue pushing forward with the rest of the landing. If the Germans were able to hold Omaha, it would create a major gap in the Allied lines and jeopardize the entire invasion. At that moment, Bradley's experience in logistics and strategy became crucial. Instead of freezing under pressure, he made the decision to divert additional reinforcements to Omaha, knowing that the success of the entire operation depended on that beach falling quickly. Meanwhile, reports from Utah Beach indicated that the landings there were going better than expected, with less resistance and a smoother execution. The beachhead there was secure, but the success of Utah did little to alleviate the mounting crisis at Omaha. For Bradley, the immediate reality was that any delay in breaking through the German defenses could spell disaster. Every minute counted. Bradley's ability to adapt to the rapidly changing situation on the ground would ultimately be what kept the invasion moving forward. His decision to push for reinforcements and continue the offensive, despite the overwhelming pressure, showcased his leadership under fire. But there were no easy answers. Bradley was in constant communication with his officers, hearing the pleas for help from the men on the beaches and understanding the human toll of the invasion. He had to balance the need to keep the invasion moving with the reality that every decision meant more lives at risk. By noon, it was clear that the Allies were making progress, but at a horrific cost. Thousands of soldiers had already fallen, and the beach was littered with bodies, debris, and abandoned equipment. But the lines were holding, and the Allies were beginning to push inland. Bradley understood that the true test wasn't the first wave. It was what came after. Once the beachhead was secure, they had to advance quickly to prevent the Germans from regrouping and launching counterattacks. It was in the quiet moments of reflection, as the first waves of soldiers pushed inland, that Bradley knew this would not be a quick victory. The battle for Normandy would drag on for weeks, and the outcome was still uncertain. But the decision he made to reinforce Omaha, to push forward despite the setbacks, would ultimately prove to be the turning point. By dusk, the invasion was no longer a mere assault. It was a full-fledged beachhead. Bradley had faced the storm head-on and emerged with the kind of leadership that would become his legacy. In the heat of battle, with every second bringing more casualties, he had done what was necessary to ensure the success of D-Day. The real work was just beginning, but Bradley's decisions on that first day had ensured that the Allies would have a foothold in Europe, a foothold that would lead to the eventual liberation of France and the collapse of the Nazi regime. The day was far from over, but as Bradley looked out over the landing forces, he could see the beginnings of a turning tide. The Allies had landed in force, and despite the bloodshed, the invasion was on track. But the true weight of leadership had not yet lifted, It would continue to press down on Bradley, as he now had to guide the forces forward through the weeks of intense combat that lay ahead. The first wave of soldiers had already hit the sand, and the sounds of battle were deafening. The massive bombardment of German positions had barely made a dent in the fortifications, and as the landing craft neared the shores of Normandy, the real horror began. For General Bradley, this was no longer a matter of strategy and planning. It was survival, and every decision had the potential to make or break the invasion. On Omaha Beach, the situation was rapidly spiraling out of control. The German defenses, with their extensive network of bunkers and gun positions, were devastatingly effective. The beach was a killing zone. The first waves of American soldiers had been cut down before they even made it ashore, their bodies piling up in the surf. Bradley, in his command center, could hear the reports streaming in: confusion, frustration, and death. Bradley had anticipated resistance, but not to this extent. He knew Omaha would be tough, but the sight of his soldiers pinned down and slaughtered before they could establish a foothold made him momentarily question whether the entire operation was in jeopardy. The beach was a literal battlefield, strewn with soldiers and wreckage, and every minute that passed meant more casualties. But Bradley wasn't a man to be overwhelmed by the chaos of the moment. He had trained for this, and he understood that leadership in times of crisis meant making rapid decisions in the face of the unknown. He had a singular goal: to secure the beach and get the men inland. The landing had to succeed, no matter the cost. His decision was immediate. The situation at Omaha required reinforcements, and Bradley knew that if he hesitated for too long, the chance to secure the beach would slip away. He ordered additional support troops, including tanks and artillery, to land and reinforce the struggling soldiers. Bradley's foresight to direct reinforcements to Omaha was crucial in turning the tide, but his decision didn't come without personal cost. The battle was chaotic, and the soldiers Bradley had relied on to carry out the mission were now facing the same brutality and losses that every soldier feared. In the midst of the horror, Bradley moved quickly from one report to the next, coordinating with commanders on the ground. Every bit of information was vital. The forward positions needed more men, more firepower, and more logistical support. Each decision was a delicate balancing act. Bradley had to weigh the immediate needs of his troops against the overall strategic goals. A misstep could have resulted in the collapse of the entire operation. The tide began to turn as Bradley's reinforcements hit the beach, but the battle was far from over. The troops, weary and bloodied, began to push inland. But Bradley knew the hardest part was yet to come: securing the exit routes from the beaches and ensuring that the Allies could sustain their beachhead long enough to break out and advance toward Paris. The sheer scale of the operation was breathtaking. Bradley, despite the dire situation, maintained his calm exterior, refusing to show the strain of the hours spent under intense pressure. The decisions he made during those critical first hours of D-Day were vital to the invasion's success. But his calmness didn't mean the burden was easy to bear. For every success, there were reports of additional casualties, unexpected complications, and a new wave of challenges to address. As Bradley surveyed the battlefield, watching his men take their positions and move forward despite the overwhelming odds, he had a moment of reflection. This was his moment, not as a general issuing orders, but as a leader guiding his soldiers through hell. The chaos was overwhelming, but there was something deeply human in the way the men carried on, despite the unimaginable violence that surrounded them. It was a testament to Bradley's leadership that, even under fire, the men trusted him to guide them. By the time the sun began to set over the Normandy coastline, the first phase of the invasion had succeeded. Omaha was secured, and the Allies had a foothold in France. But there was no time for celebration. The German forces were regrouping, and the Allies had to press forward. The first day of the invasion had been an unqualified success in the sense that they had broken through the German defenses, but it had come at a tremendous cost. Bradley's calm, decisive leadership under fire had made all the difference, but the true test of his leadership was far from over. With the beachhead established, Bradley knew that securing the inland advance would be just as difficult as the landings themselves. But for that day, at least, the scale of the operation and the courage of his men had proven that success was possible. Bradley had held the line, and the Allies now had a path forward, one that would eventually lead to the liberation of France and the eventual defeat of Nazi Germany. In the Azov, hours after the fighting had died down, Bradley surveyed the battlefield, knowing that the days ahead would only grow more complicated. But as he looked at the men around him, exhausted, wounded, but resolute, he knew they had passed the first, most critical test. The Normandy invasion was just beginning, and Bradley was ready for what came next. By the morning of June 7, 1944, the initial chaos of D-Day had settled into a precarious calm. The Allies had secured the beachhead, but the cost was already evident. Thousands of casualties, the remains of destroyed tanks and equipment scattered across the sand, and soldiers, exhausted, wounded, or dead, littering the beach. For General Bradley, the enormity of the victory was mixed with the harsh reality of the price paid to achieve it. The immediate days following the invasion were filled with grim assessments. Bradley, standing in the midst of the battlefield, faced a battlefield that was not just marked by the violence of the assault, but by the logistical nightmare of getting men, supplies, and reinforcements inland. The weather had turned, making transportation even more difficult, and every decision seemed to come with a personal toll. Each report he received from the front was a reminder of the human cost of war, soldiers who had been lost, families forever altered, and entire divisions devastated by the unrelenting German defenses. But Bradley knew that there was no time to dwell on the losses. The success of the beachhead was only the first step. Now he had to guide the troops through the critical days and weeks that would determine whether the invasion was truly successful. The Germans had not yet been broken, and the Allies had no guarantee that they could hold their ground, let alone push forward. The logistical challenges were immense. Supplies had to be moved from the beaches to the front lines, but the narrow roads were packed with military vehicles, and the constant threat of German counterattacks kept the Allies on edge. Every movement, every shift in strategy had to be meticulously planned. Bradley, with his detailed mind and calm demeanor, became the central figure in coordinating these efforts. Where many saw chaos, Bradley saw an opportunity to impose order on the disarray. The emotional toll on Bradley was evident in the days following, the landings. Despite his calm exterior, there were moments when the weight of leadership and the brutality of the conflict seemed unbearable. His responsibility for every soldier under his command weighed heavily on him, especially as the number of casualties grew. Every report of a unit under heavy fire, every request for reinforcements, reminded him that his decisions were not just strategic, they were life and death decisions for the men on the ground. But Bradley's ability to compartmentalize his emotions and focus on the task at hand became essential to the Allies' continued success. He had to push forward, even when his own doubts crept in. As the battle unfolded, Bradley found that his leadership style, quiet, deliberate, and steady, was more essential than ever. While Montgomery's boldness could inspire and Patton's bravado could rally, Bradley's calm under pressure was exactly what was needed to keep the Allies from veering off course. As the days turned into weeks, the campaign moved inland. The Allied forces began to advance toward key French cities, and every step was met with fierce resistance. The Germans, though caught off guard by the initial success of the invasion, regrouped and dug in. For Bradley, each victory on the ground brought new challenges as the Germans began to launch counterattacks to slow the Allied advance. In these moments, Bradley's leadership would again be tested. He had to make decisions that balanced the urgency of advancing with the necessity of securing the gains they had made. The soldiers in the field were exhausted. Many had fought through the brutal landing and now faced the equally perilous task of pushing through the hedgerows of Normandy. The countryside was filled with hidden German positions, and every advance could mean walking into a trap. The psychological toll of the battle was also beginning to show. The soldiers, after days of constant combat, were experiencing the fatigue of war, the mental and physical exhaustion that comes from fighting day in and day out, with no clear end in sight. It was here that Bradley's quiet understanding of human nature proved invaluable. He knew that victory was not just about pushing forward with military might. It was about sustaining morale, keeping the troops focused, and making sure that they had the strength to continue. He visited the front lines, spoke with soldiers, and did everything in his power to maintain their resolve. He spoke to them not as a general from a distance, but as a man who understood the toll war takes. Bradley's presence, calm and reassuring, gave the soldiers a sense of confidence that they were not alone in the fight. His leadership was a stabilizing force that kept the Allies moving forward, even when the pressure seemed insurmountable. But as the weeks passed and the Allies continued their push, the true scale of the war became clear. Normandy was only the beginning. The liberation of France was a crucial step, but there was still the rest of Europe to conquer, and the psychological strain on Bradley and his men was immense. Yet through it all, Bradley maintained a level of professionalism that set him apart from many of his peers. He was not driven by the desire for glory, nor by the need for recognition. He was driven by a singular purpose, to see the war through to the end and to bring his men home. As the Allies advanced through Normandy and toward Paris, Bradley's role as a leader, strategist, and human being continued to evolve. He would be faced with countless more decisions that would shape the outcome of the war. But in those early days after the invasion, his leadership under pressure had already proven that he was more than capable of guiding the Allies through the challenges that lay ahead. The invasion had succeeded, but the long road to victory was just beginning. After the brutal days of June 1944, as the Allied forces pushed forward through Normandy and eventually to Paris, General Omar Bradley's leadership was not only about the immediate military strategies, but also about his ability to oversee the long-term vision of the war effort. The invasion, while a monumental success, was just one phase of the ongoing campaign that would stretch across Europe, and Bradley's role was far from finished. With the success of D-Day, Bradley's leadership was critical in sustaining the momentum of the invasion. The battle for Normandy turned into weeks of relentless fighting as the Allies advanced through the hedgerows of France, facing entrenched German defenses that were more formidable than anticipated. But as one of the primary commanders overseeing the operations, Bradley's cool-headed decision-making during these crucial weeks helped ensure that the Allies would not be stopped. By mid-July, Bradley's forces were moving through France with increasing success. The liberation of Paris in late August was a symbolic and strategic victory, and Bradley's leadership in this campaign was instrumental. His understanding of logistics and coordination was crucial in maintaining the flow of supplies and reinforcements that allowed the Allies to advance. Despite the successes, Bradley was acutely aware of the human cost of the war. Each victory brought with it more casualties, and each strategy was a calculation of how far to push, how much risk to take, and when to hold back. Bradley's biggest challenge during this period was managing the disparate armies of the Allies, U.S. forces, British forces, and other Allied contingents, each with its own priorities and operational differences. He was able to bridge these gaps using his diplomatic acumen as much as his military expertise to keep the Allied forces united. His management of tensions with other commanders, such as Montgomery, showed his ability to take a step back from personal rivalries and focus on the bigger picture. Unlike Montgomery, who often sought to impose his will on the operation, Bradley focused on collaboration and coordination, making him the glue that held the various armies together. But it wasn't just about coordination. It was about decisiveness. Bradley understood that the war could not be won without pushing further into enemy territory, and that was exactly what he did as the Allies moved into Belgium and into the heart of Germany. The Battle of the Bulge, fought in December 1944, would test every one of Bradley's capabilities as a leader. A surprise German offensive in the Ardennes forest threatened to push back the Allied forces, and Bradley's command was put to the test once again. With the enemy pushing hard, the stakes were incredibly high. But Bradley remained resolute in his response, organizing reinforcements and helping to stabilize the front lines. His calm and authoritative presence in these moments kept his forces steady, even in the face of overwhelming adversity. The Battle of the Bulge would eventually end in an Allied victory, but Bradley's leadership during this crisis was critical to turning the tide. As the war entered its final stages, Bradley's role shifted from managing immediate combat operations to preparing for the inevitable victory. The Allies pushed into Germany, and Bradley was instrumental in the final campaigns that led to the collapse of the Nazi regime. By April 1945, when Adolf Hitler had committed suicide and the Third Reich was crumbling, Bradley's role was less about tactical operations and more about the strategic landscape of post-war Europe. The war was nearing its conclusion, but Bradley's legacy would continue long after the final surrender was signed. In the post-war years, he served as the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a role that allowed him to influence military policy and guide the development of the U.S. Armed Forces in the early years of the Cold War. As a statesman, Bradley helped shape the future of American military doctrine and the development of NATO, understanding that the lessons of World War II would need to inform global strategies in the years to come. Bradley was also part of the military leadership that oversaw the occupation of Germany, helping to reshape the country's future and ensure a peaceful transition into post-war Europe. His leadership was not just about military strategy, it was about guiding a fractured world into a new era. Despite his successes, Bradley remained a humble figure, never seeking the spotlight and always focused on the well-being of his men and the country he had helped to save. In the years after the war, Bradley's legacy continued to be shaped by his actions on the battlefield and his leadership in peace. He was respected not only for his military acumen, but for the integrity and character he displayed throughout the war. Unlike many of his contemporaries, Bradley was never interested in personal fame. Instead, his focus remained on serving his country and ensuring that the sacrifices made during the war were honored and remembered. His leadership style became a model for future generations of military leaders, emphasizing calm under pressure, strategic foresight, and a commitment to collaboration. Bradley's final years were marked by his contributions to American society as a respected elder statesman. He was awarded the Presidential Medal of Freedom and received numerous honors for his service. When he passed away in 1981, the world mourned not just a military leader, but a man whose steady hand and wise counsel had guided the United States through its darkest hours and into a future of peace and prosperity. Today, General Omar Bradley's legacy endures as a symbol of steady leadership in times of crisis. His role in the Normandy invasion, his calm under fire, and his ability to manage complex and diverse forces in the heat of battle made him one of the most respected figures of World War II. But his legacy is also one of humility, wisdom, and a commitment to serving both his men and his country. In the end, General Bradley was not only a man who led a successful military campaign. He was a man who understood the true cost of war and worked tirelessly to ensure that the world would never forget the sacrifices made to secure peace. As the dust settled on the beaches of Normandy, the Allies had secured a critical foothold in Western Europe. But the impact of that first day, the landing that would become known as D-Day, was far greater than the immediate military success. It marked a turning point not only in the war, but in the history of the 20th century, and its reverberations would continue to echo for decades to come. For General Bradley, the success of Normandy was just the beginning. But even in those early days, as the beaches were secured and the Allied forces began to push inland, he understood that the true victory of D-Day lay not in the number of soldiers who survived the assault, but in the broader implications for the world that lay ahead. The liberation of France was the first step in a longer journey, one that would ultimately lead to the downfall of Nazi Germany and the restoration of peace to Europe. Yet, even in the heat of battle, Bradley knew that this victory was a testament to the strength and unity of the Allies, a reminder that what was achieved at Normandy was the culmination of years of struggle, sacrifice, and cooperation. As the war raged on, the lessons learned at Normandy would continue to inform the strategies and tactics used by the Allied forces. For Bradley, the experience reinforced his belief in meticulous planning, coordinated execution, and, most importantly, the preservation of morale. It was a lesson that would guide him in subsequent campaigns and one that would influence the post-war world in ways that would outlast the battle itself. In the immediate aftermath of the war, the world had to reckon with the consequences of the conflict. Europe was left in ruins, its cities shattered, its economies crippled, and its people exhausted by years of violence and fear. Yet, in the midst of this devastation, the success of the Normandy invasion would become a symbol of hope, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, courage and unity could triumph. The success of D-Day had not only sealed the fate of Nazi Germany, but had also set the stage for the broader geopolitical realignment that would shape the post-war world. The United States, having emerged victorious from the war, would now find itself at the center of the global stage, a position that Bradley and his fellow commanders would help navigate in the coming years. The Cold War, with its ideological battle between the capitalist West and the communist East, would dominate international relations for much of the second half of the century, but the foundations of the world that emerged from the war were laid on the beaches of Normandy. Bradley's legacy as a leader was cemented not just by his role in planning and executing the invasion, but by the way he helped guide the American military through the challenges that followed. His leadership during the war was marked by a steady hand and a focus on the long-term objectives of peace and stability, and these values would continue to guide him in the years following the war. But beyond the military and political ramifications, the true legacy of D-Day lay in the personal stories of the soldiers who fought and died on those beaches. For them, Normandy was not just a strategic moment in the war. It was a life-changing experience, one that left them with memories of comrades lost and victories won in the most unimaginable circumstances. For many, it was a defining moment that would haunt them for the rest of their lives. As for Bradley, the battlefields of Normandy were a symbol of what was possible when leaders could rise to the occasion, when soldiers could be counted on to do what was necessary despite the personal cost. His ability to remain calm under pressure, to make decisions in the heat of battle, and to steer his forces through the chaos of war set him apart as one of the greatest military leaders of his time. His approach to leadership, which combined strategic brilliance with a deep understanding of the human cost of war, became a model for future generations of commanders. The legacy of D-Day and of Bradley's leadership continues to echo in the world today. It's present in the memory of every soldier who fought, in every monument erected in their honor, and in the enduring values of freedom and democracy that the Allies fought to preserve. The world that emerged from the war, though fraught with new challenges, was shaped by the sacrifice and courage displayed on those beaches. As we reflect on the events of June 6, 1944, we are reminded not just of the victory, but of the courage, resilience, and unity required to achieve it. We remember the sacrifices of those who fought, and we remember the men who led them, men like General Bradley, whose legacy is not just etched in the annals of military history, but in the very fabric of the world we live in today. The echoes of Normandy are still with us, a reminder of what we can achieve when we stand together, united in purpose and undeterred by adversity. By the time the Allies reached the final stages of the war in Europe, the reality of victory had long since begun to set in. The Normandy invasion, the Battle of the Bulge, the relentless push through France, and the capture of Germany's western cities had paved the way for the Allies to march toward Berlin. As the Nazis began to crumble under the weight of the Allied advance, General Bradley's role in the closing chapters of the war became even more crucial. However, by the time Bradley and his men stood at the gates of Germany, victory had come at an increasingly steep price. The constant march through European soil, the never-ending battles, and the toll of casualties had left deep scars, not only on the soldiers, but on Bradley himself. Every victory, every push forward, was shadowed by the ever-growing human cost of the war. The liberation of France had come at a brutal cost. The brutal fighting at places like Omaha Beach, the hedgerow battles, and the battlefields of the Ardennes all bore witness to the sacrifices made by countless men. By the time the Allies crossed into Germany, the war's end was in sight. The Germans were on the defensive, their military shattered, their leadership broken, and their resistance increasingly futile. The war in Europe was drawing to a close, but for Bradley it was a moment to pause and reflect. The landscape had changed. No longer was he fighting for survival or for a beachhead. Now the focus was on securing the peace and ensuring that the war would not spiral into an endless conflict, even after the Axis powers were defeated. But there was still one crucial battle to fight: the capture of Berlin, the symbolic and strategic center of Nazi power. The final assault on the German capital had a dual purpose. Not only was it the physical destruction of a regime, but it was also a psychological end to the war. For Bradley, the march toward Berlin was bittersweet. He was aware of the heavy losses, the devastation that his soldiers faced every day, but he also recognized that the end of the war would bring both relief and sorrow. By April 1945, as the war in Europe began to wind down, Bradley had seen firsthand the cost of the military victories, the bodies, the destruction, the civilian suffering. As the Allies pressed into Berlin, the horrors of the concentration camps were uncovered, the full scale of the Holocaust revealed to the world. Bradley, along with the rest of the Allied leadership, had to come to terms with the magnitude of the atrocities committed by the Nazi regime. The war's victory was also the painful acknowledgment of the horrors humanity was capable of inflicting upon itself. In those final days, as Bradley's leadership helped guide the Allies to their victory, he found himself reflecting not just on the triumphs, but on the deeper, more personal cost of war. The men he had commanded, brave soldiers who had given everything for the cause, were coming to grips with their own experiences. The psychological scars, the unseen wounds of war, were beginning to take hold, and Bradley knew that for many of these men, the fight was not over just because the war had ended. The consequences of what they had lived through would stay with them forever. The war in Europe ended on May 7, 1945, with Germany's surrender. But for Bradley, it was not a time of celebration. It was a time for somber reflection. As he stood in the aftermath of victory, surrounded by his men, Bradley understood the weight of their collective achievement. They had liberated a continent. They had overthrown a regime of unimaginable evil. But at what cost? The sacrifices were staggering, and the full impact of the war on the soldiers, on the civilians, and on the world as a whole would take years to fully comprehend. Bradley, for his part, would never forget the faces of the men who had fought under his command, nor the weight of the decisions he had made during the war. Victory for all. Its importance came with the heavy burden of responsibility. As the war in Europe ended, Bradley began his transition to post-war life. He would go on to serve as the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, a role that allowed him to help guide the American military during the early years of the Cold War. The lessons of World War II, and of D-Day in particular, informed his approach to military strategy in the years that followed. Bradley remained a leader who balanced the cost of war with the necessity of peace, understanding that military power must always be wielded with a deep respect for its consequences. In his later years, Bradley reflected on the war not just as a military achievement, but as a human experience. The victory at Normandy, the final battles in Europe, and the subsequent establishment of peace all bore the fingerprints of the soldiers who had fought, bled, and died in the trenches. Bradley's legacy would be marked not just by his leadership on the battlefield, but by his recognition of the human cost of war and his commitment to ensuring that future generations would not forget the lessons learned in the struggle against tyranny. In the end, the final reckoning of World War II was not just a victory over the Axis powers. It was a profound reminder of the sacrifices that must be made to preserve freedom and peace. General Bradley's leadership during those final days was a testament to the enduring strength of the human spirit and the power of cooperation, even in the face of unimaginable challenges. The final months of World War II saw the Allied forces celebrate their hard-won victory. But for General Omar Bradley, victory was not the end. It was a new beginning. The war in Europe was over, but the world that emerged from it was dramatically different, and Bradley's role in shaping that world was just as significant as his contributions during the conflict itself. In the immediate aftermath of the war, Bradley's focus shifted from military command to shaping the future of the U.S. military. As the first chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, he found himself at the helm of a rapidly changing global landscape. The threat of communism loomed large, and the Cold War was beginning to take shape. For Bradley, this was an opportunity to influence the direction of American military strategy, ensuring that the lessons of World War II would not be forgotten. During his time as chairman, Bradley worked tirelessly to reshape the U.S. military for the challenges of the post-war world. The rise of nuclear weapons, the importance of international alliances, and the evolving nature of warfare all required a new kind of leadership, one that Bradley provided with his usual steadiness and foresight. He was deeply involved in the establishment of NATO and the development of military strategies that would ensure the security of Western Europe in the face of Soviet expansion. Yet, for all his professional accomplishments, Bradley's personal reflections on the war were marked by a quiet sorrow. The victory at Normandy had been monumental, but the human cost of that victory weighed heavily on him. The lives lost, the soldiers who would never return, and the families that had been shattered were always in his mind. While the Allied victory in Europe was a triumph of military strategy and unity, Bradley never allowed himself to forget the price of that success. In the years following the war, Bradley became a respected public figure, but his humility remained one of his defining characteristics. He did not seek the spotlight, nor did he allow the accolades to cloud his sense of duty. Even as he received numerous honors for his role in the war, he remained focused on the work that still needed to be done, both in military strategy and in the rebuilding of a fractured world. As the Cold War took hold and new geopolitical tensions emerged, Bradley's leadership was instrumental in ensuring that the U.S. military remained strong and united. His contributions to American defense policy during this period were invaluable as he helped guide the country through some of its most precarious moments. Despite his growing fame and influence, Bradley remained a figure who sought collaboration, balance, and understanding. His approach to leadership was rooted in a profound respect for the human cost of war, and he carried that philosophy with him into the peace that followed. On a personal level, Bradley remained a private man, more at ease in the company of his family than with the trappings of fame. His post-war life was marked by quiet reflection. In his later years, as the world around him continued to change, he looked back on the war not with pride, but with a sense of duty fulfilled. For Bradley, the true meaning of victory lay not in the accolades he received, but in the knowledge that he had done everything within his power to bring an end to the conflict and create a lasting peace. In his retirement, Bradley continued to be a voice of reason and wisdom. He wrote his memoirs, offering an introspective look at his experiences during the war and reflecting on the lessons he had learned from a lifetime of service. His writings, though not filled with grandiose proclamations, conveyed the depth of his understanding of the war, his role in it, and the cost of victory. As he neared the end of his life, Bradley's legacy was firmly established. He was not just a military commander, but a symbol of steady leadership in the face of unimaginable adversity. His quiet, methodical approach to warfare, his ability to make difficult decisions under pressure, and his unwavering commitment to his men and his country made him one of the most respected figures in American military history. Bradley passed away in 1981 at the age of 88. His death marked the end of an era, but his influence lived on. The military strategies he helped develop, the lessons he imparted on leadership, and the way he navigated the post-war world would continue to shape the U.S. military for years to come. Today, General Bradley is remembered not just for his role in D-Day and World War II, but for the way he shaped the peace that followed. His leadership was a quiet but unshakable force that guided both his soldiers and his nation through the darkest days of war and into the uncertain years of the Cold War. His legacy is one of humility, sacrifice, and an enduring commitment to service, a reminder that true leadership is not about the glory one receives, but the lives one touches and the world one helps to build. In the final analysis, General Bradley's story is not just about the victory in Normandy, but about the enduring impact of that victory on the world and the principles that guided him throughout his life. His legacy stands as a testament to the power of steady leadership, humility, and the unyielding belief that victory, no matter how hard won, is always tempered by the price of war.